Elena Carter had always lived in the quiet rhythm of the small town where every face was familiar and every street felt safe. Her world had been that way since she was a little girl, ever since the night a drunk driver had taken both her parents in an instant. She had been just 7 years old, too young to fully understand why her father's warm voice would never greet her again, too small to grasp why her mother's soft hands would never tuck her in. Her grandmother, Ruth, had taken her in without hesitation, building a cocoon of gentleness around her. Under Ruth's watchful care, Elena had grown into a young woman who knew little of the world's sharp edges. She was 21 now, with wide hazel eyes that seemed to reflect every flicker of emotion, and a softness in her voice that made people lean closer to hear her speak. She had never dated, never kissed anyone, never felt the rush of being held. Her life had been simple: school, helping in the little town library, and evenings spent making tea for her grandmother while they watched the sun dip behind the hills. But that peace began to fracture the day Ruth fell ill. The hospital bills piled up faster than the autumn leaves outside their old house. Savings vanished, credit ran thin, and the small pension Ruth had lived on barely covered her medication. Elena had tried everything: extra shifts at the library, selling her mother's jewelry, even pawning the old family piano. But it was like pouring water into a bottomless well. The knock at the door came on a rain-slick afternoon, the kind where the air feels heavy with something about to change. Elena opened it to find a man she had never seen before, though she somehow recognized him. Damien Cross. Even in their little town, his name carried weight. 48 years old, a self-made millionaire who had clawed his way up from nothing to build an empire of real estate and private investments. The local papers called him ruthless, brilliant, dangerous. Standing there on her porch, rain dripping from the brim of his black coat, he looked exactly like the kind of man who could unmake someone with a single word. "Elena Carter?" His voice was deep, controlled, each syllable deliberate. She nodded, unsure why her heart had begun to pound. He didn't smile. Instead, he stepped inside when she moved aside, his presence filling the modest living room in a way that made it feel smaller. Ruth sat in her armchair by the window, pale but alert, her eyes fixed on him with a strange mix of wariness and relief. They talked in low tones at first, words Elena couldn't quite catch, but then Ruth's gaze flicked toward her, and Damien turned those cold, assessing eyes on her fully. "I can take care of her," he said, and Elena realized he wasn't talking about Ruth, he was talking about her. "But it will be under my terms." Her brows furrowed. "What do you mean?" His answer was calm, almost businesslike. "Marry me. In exchange, your grandmother will have the best medical care money can buy. The debt will vanish. You'll never want for anything again." The words slammed into her chest, leaving her breathless. "Marry you? I don't even know you." "You will," he said simply. It was absurd, unthinkable. Yet as her grandmother's thin fingers reached for hers, as she saw the silent plea in Ruth's eyes, Elena felt the walls close in. Damien Cross was a stranger, a man twice her age, a man whose reasons for wanting her were as murky as a storm-lit sea. She wanted to say no, but the sound of her grandmother's labored breathing and the weight of the unpaid bills pressed down on her like iron. And so she just stood there, her pulse thundering in her ears, wondering what kind of man would make such an offer, and what he truly wanted from her in return. The wedding came far too soon for Elena Carter. 2 weeks had passed in a blur since Damien Cross's offer, and she still felt as though she were trapped in someone else's life. The days had been a tangle of dress fittings, signatures on papers she barely understood, and whispered conversations between Damien and her grandmother that always stopped the moment she entered the room. She told herself she was only doing this for Ruth, that it was just a transaction, but the thought of standing beside Damien and becoming his wife sent a shiver of something she could not name down her spine. The morning of the ceremony, the sky hung heavy with clouds, as though it too disapproved. She stood before the mirror in a simple ivory gown, her hands trembling as the seamstress adjusted the lace at her shoulders. She barely recognized the young woman staring back at her. The wide hazel eyes were hers, but they looked too large, too frightened. Her hair was swept into an elegant twist, revealing the delicate slope of her neck and the small pearl earrings her mother had once worn. Damien arrived at the small private venue, already waiting at the altar by the time she stepped inside. His tall frame was a silhouette against the dim glow of the chandeliers. He wore a perfectly tailored charcoal suit and a black tie, his dark hair combed neatly back. His expression was unreadable as his eyes found hers. Across the room, she thought she saw the faintest flicker of something in his gaze, but it vanished before she could name it. There were only a handful of witnesses, a judge instead of a priest, no flowers, no music, just the low murmur of the judge's voice and the sound of Elena's own heartbeat pounding in her ears. When the words "do you take?" this man reached her, she hesitated for a breathless moment before forcing the words, "I do," from her lips. Damien's "I do" was steady, deep, and certain. He did not kiss her after the judge. He pronounced them husband and wife. Instead, he took her hand in his grip warm but firm, and led her toward the waiting black car outside. The drive to his estate was silent. Elena sat rigid in the leather seat, staring out at the blur of city lights until they faded into the dark silhouette of the countryside. When the gates to the sprawling mansion opened, her breath caught. Marble pillars loomed high, and the windows glowed with golden light. The house was too large, too perfect, and yet there was a strange chill in the air as they stepped inside. Damien's voice broke the silence. "You will have your own room for now." He gestured toward the grand staircase. "You are not a prisoner here, Elena, but you will respect my rules." She wanted to ask what those rules were, but something in his tone kept her silent. As the butler led her down the long hallway to a room draped in soft gold and cream, she felt the weight of the door closing behind her more than she wanted to admit. She set her small overnight bag on the bed, her fingers brushing over the silk coverlet. Her life had changed in the space of a few words and signatures, and now she was alone in a stranger's house with a man whose intentions were locked as tightly as the rooms she had passed along the way. Somewhere deep inside, a quiet question stirred. Was Damien Cross a savior, or had she just stepped willingly into a cage? The first morning in Damien's mansion felt like waking in another world. Sunlight spilled through the tall windows, painting soft patterns across the polished floors. Elena moved quietly through the room, still in the silk robe that had been laid out for her by the staff. She had barely slept, her mind replaying every moment of the night before. She remembered the heavy silence, the distance in Damien's voice, and the way his eyes had lingered on her just long enough to make her wonder what he was thinking. The breakfast table in the grand dining room stretched so far, it felt strange to sit at one end alone. The butler served her coffee and fruit without a word. Somewhere deeper in the house, she heard the low murmur of Damien's voice speaking on the phone. The sound drew her toward the study door, left slightly ajar. She paused, her fingers brushing the carved wood. His tone was sharper now, colder like steel cutting through air. She caught fragments of words she did not understand, risk asset disposal, and finally, the one that made her pulse quicken. "We cannot let the past repeat itself." The door creaked and she stepped back quickly as it swung open. Damien stood there, still holding the phone, his blue eyes locked on hers for a moment that felt far too long. He said nothing, just closed the door behind him and walked away, leaving her heart pounding. Later, Elena wandered the mansion's endless halls. The air held a faint scent of cedar and something older, a smell like the pages of antique books. Many of the rooms were locked, heavy, brass keys missing from the ornate handles. She pressed her ear to one door and thought she heard the faint clink of glass like a decanter being set down. When footsteps sounded behind her, she spun to find the housekeeper watching with unreadable eyes. "That wing is not in use," she said softly before turning away. That evening, Damien returned late. A storm had rolled in Liggy. Lightning flashing beyond the tall windows. The lights flickered once, then went out, plunging the hall into darkness. Elena froze, unable to see her way back to her room. A moment later, a hand closed gently around her arm. Damien's voice came low and steady. "I have you." He guided her through the shadows until they reached the safety of the lit drawing room where the fire crackled warmly. For the first time, she saw something unguarded in his face as the firelight caught it. His hand lingered at her elbow just long enough for her to notice before he stepped back. His voice was quiet, almost too quiet. "You should be careful in this house, Elena. There are things here you do not yet understand. She wanted to ask what he meant, but the words stuck in her throat. He turned away, the shadows swallowing his tall frame, and the only thing she knew for certain was that whatever secrets this mansion held, they were tied to the man she had just married, and the past he seemed determined to hide. Days began to take on a strange rhythm in the mansion. Elena would wake to the sound of faint footsteps in the hall, followed by the quiet clink of a breakfast tray being set outside her door. The staff were polite but distant, never speaking more than a few words. She wondered if they had been told to keep their distance or if it was their own choice. The silence made her feel like a guest in her own life. Damien remained a shadow, moving through rooms she rarely saw him in. He left early most mornings and returned late at night, often without a word. Yet even in his absence, she felt his presence in the smallest details. The library door left open with a light burning inside. The vase of fresh lilies that appeared in her room without explanation. The sudden disappearance of a stack of unpaid hospital invoices from her desk. One afternoon, she found herself in the garden, walking along the gravel path lined with roses. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of rain. She stopped at the edge of the fountain and saw Damien standing at the far end, speaking to a man in a dark suit. Their voices were low, but the tension in Damien's posture was unmistakable. The other man glanced toward her, and Damien's eyes followed. A flicker of something passed over his face before he dismissed the man with a curt nod and walked toward her. He asked if she liked the gardens. She said yes, but the question felt like it was only meant to fill the space between them. He stood beside her for a moment silent, his gaze fixed on the rippling water. Then without looking at her, he said, "If anyone speaks to you about me, about my past, you are not to answer." His voice was calm, but there was a weight in it that made her chest tighten. That night at a formal dinner in the East Wing, she saw another side of him. A man across the table made a careless remark about her age, about her being more of an ornament than a wife. The words burned, but before she could respond, Damien's voice cut through the room, cold and precise. "She is my wife," he said, and his eyes locked on the man until the color drained from his face. "No one here will disrespect her." After the guests had gone, she found herself thinking about that moment. The way he had spoken left no room for doubt, no hesitation. It was not kindness exactly, but something more protective, something that made her feel safer than she wanted to admit. Later in her room, she tried to read, but her mind kept drifting back to him. She could still see the sharp line of his jaw in the candlelight, the way his gaze had swept the room as if daring anyone to challenge him. She told herself she should be wary that he was still a man full of secrets, but somewhere deep inside, a quieter truth was beginning to take root. She was starting to wonder what it might feel like if he ever looked at her, not out of duty, but out of something far more dangerous. The night the nightmare came felt different from the start. Rain tapped against the tall windows in her room, the sound slow and uneven like a heartbeat out of rhythm. Elena had been restless all evening, pacing the edge of her bed and staring at the pale glow of the moon through the curtains. When she finally drifted into sleep, it was not peaceful. She was back in the twisted wreck of metal that had been her parents' car, the air thick with the scent of gasoline. Her mother's voice called her name once, then again, softer, fading into the darkness. She woke with a cry, her chest heaving, her nightgown clinging to her skin with cold sweat. The door to her room opened without a knock. Damien stepped inside, his shirt sleeves rolled up, his dark hair slightly mussed as though he had been working late. His eyes scanned her quickly, taking in her trembling hands and the wild panic in her gaze. He crossed the room in a few strides and sat on the edge of her bed, his presence grounding her in a way she had not expected. "Tell me what happened." His voice was low, steady. She tried to speak, but the memory caught in her throat. He waited silently, his hand resting near hers but not touching until she reached for it on her own. The warmth of his palm steadied her enough to whisper fragments about the crash, about the sounds, and the helplessness that still haunted her. His expression shifted, something hard in his eyes, softening. He said he understood because he too had lost someone without the chance to save them. He did not give details, but the raw edge in his tone made her believe him. For a long time they sat in silence, broken only by the rain. His thumb brushed across her knuckles, slow and careful, as if afraid she might pull away. When he finally spoke again, his voice carried a weight she had not heard before. "You are safe here, Elena. Nothing will happen to you while I am in this house." She believed him in that moment, though she could not explain why. Before he left, he adjusted the blanket around her shoulders and paused at the door, looking back at her. His face was unreadable, but his eyes lingered for just a heartbeat longer than necessary. Then the door closed and she was alone again, yet not entirely. The warmth from his hand stayed with her long after the sound of his footsteps faded down the hall. Lying in the dim light, she realized this was the first time she had seen more than the guarded figure who had married her out of an arrangement. She had seen a man who knew pain, a man capable of gentleness beneath all that control. It unsettled her more than his coldness ever had, because it made her wonder what else he was hiding. Not to keep her out, but perhaps to keep himself from falling in. The days that followed felt different, though. Nothing between them was spoken aloud. Elena began to see Damien in small moments, rather than just in the grand ones. She would come down to breakfast and find him already there, reading the paper, his coffee untouched until she arrived. In the afternoons, she sometimes crossed paths with him in the library, his attention fixed on some document, yet always lifting his eyes to her as if to make sure she was well. There was no warmth in his words, but something in the way his gaze lingered told her more than any smile could. One rainy evening, she wandered into the library alone. The scent of old leather and cedar filled the air. She traced her fingers along the spines of books until she stopped at a shelf just out of reach. Stretching up on her toes, she felt a shadow behind her. Damien's hand reached past hers and slid the book free with ease. His arm brushed against her shoulder. The Conti. Act brief, but enough to make her breath catch. Their eyes met, and for a moment neither of them moved. His gaze was intense, as though he were reading something in her face. She broke the moment, first mumbling a thank you, but her heart was beating too fast as she left the room. She could feel his eyes on her back until she turned the corner. At dinner that night, she noticed how close they sat at the long table. The flicker of candlelight caught the edges of his face and the soft movement of his hand as he poured her wine. She wondered if he noticed the way her fingers tightened on the glass when his brushed hers. She kept her eyes on her plate, but every sound seemed sharper. The clink of silver, the low hum of his voice as he spoke to the butler, the faint sigh he gave when he leaned back in his chair. Later, as she passed his study, she saw the door open a fraction. Damien was speaking on the phone, his voice low and controlled. She caught her own name and paused just long enough to hear him say, "She is adjusting," before the floor creaked under her weight, and he turned. The way he looked at her was not the way a stranger looked at someone. It was sharper, searching, and it made her chest tighten. That night in her room, she lay awake, replaying the moments in the library, at the dinner table, in the hall. It was no longer fear that unsettled her, but something else entirely, a pull she could neither explain nor fight. She told herself to be cautious, that Damien Cross was still a man wrapped in too many layers of mystery. But somewhere beneath that warning, her heart had already started to ignore the rules. The day her aunt arrived uninvited began with a strange stillness in the house. Elena had been reading in the sunroom when the sound of tires crunching over gravel drew her gaze to the driveway. A sleek silver car she did not recognize pulled up, and the door opened to reveal her Aunt Marion stepping out in a tailored coat and sharp heels. The sight of her brought back the weight of years spent under her criticism, years where nothing Elena did was enough. Marion swept into the foyer without waiting to be invited, her eyes scanning the high ceilings and marble floors with thinly veiled envy. She found Elena standing at the foot of the stairs and smiled in that familiar way that never reached her eyes. "Well, you have done well for yourself," she said, her tone sweet but edged with something sharper. Elena opened her mouth to respond, but the sound of footsteps descending the stairs drew both their attention. Damien appeared, his expression unreadable as he approached Marion. She looked him up and down, and then with a smirk said, "So this is the man who bought himself a young bride." The words hung in the air like poison. Elena's cheeks burned, but before she could speak, Damien's voice cut through the room. "You are in my home," he said evenly, "and you will not speak to my wife like that." His blue eyes were cold now, focused entirely on Marion. "If you cannot manage civility, I will have the driver take you back to the city." She faltered, clearly unused to being challenged like this, and muttered something about only coming to check on her niece. Damien stepped closer, his presence filling the space between them. "Elena stays here because she chooses to, not because of you or anyone else." Marion's gaze flicked to Elena, then back to him before she turned sharply and left the house as quickly as she had arrived. The door closed, and silence fell. Damien looked at Elena for a long moment, as if to be sure she was. "All right," she managed a quiet "thank you," but he only nodded and walked past her toward his study, leaving her with a strange warmth in her chest. That evening she found herself lingering near the sitting room where he was reading by the fire. He looked up when she stepped inside, and for a moment neither of them spoke. She crossed the room and sat beside him, the flicker of the flames casting soft light across his face. There was a steadiness in his gaze now, one that made her feel safe in a way she had not felt in years. Without thinking, she leaned closer, resting her shoulder lightly against his arm. Damien did not move away. His voice was low when he finally spoke. "You do not have to thank me for protecting you, Elena. That is my responsibility." She glanced up at him, and in his eyes saw no hint of calculation, only a quiet promise that whatever shadows lingered in this house, he would not let them touch her. In that moment, she realized she had begun to trust him more than she had ever thought possible. The trip to the coast was Damien's idea, though he offered no explanation beyond saying they could both use a change of air. They left the mansion early in the morning, the city slipping away behind them as the car wound along narrow roads lined with wind-bent trees. Hours later, they arrived at a secluded villa perched on a cliff above the sea. The air was sharper here, filled with the scent of salt and the constant murmur of waves against the rocks. Below the terrace, the water stretched endlessly silver in the fading light. Elena had never seen anything like it. She spent the first hours wandering through the villa's open rooms, the walls lined with tall windows that caught every shift of the sun. Damien was quieter than usual, though his eyes followed her in a way that made her pulse quicken. That evening he joined her on the terrace, a blanket draped over one arm. Without asking, he set it around. And her shoulders, his fingers brushing the back of her neck for a moment too long. The sky was darkening into deep blue when she asked the question that had been pressing at her since their wedding. "Why did you marry me, Damien?" His gaze stayed on the horizon for a long moment before he answered. "You remind me of something I lost a long time ago. Something I thought I would never see again." She waited, but he did not explain further. Instead, he asked about her past and listened without interrupting as she spoke of her grandmother, her quiet life in the small town, and the way she had always felt like she was waiting for something without knowing what. When the words slipped out that she had never been with anyone, she almost wished she could take them back, but Damien only looked at her with that same steady gaze. "I will never touch you unless you ask me to. Elena, you have my word." The promise was simple, but it landed deep in her chest, carrying more weight than she could understand. They stayed outside until the stars emerged, scattered like silver dust across the sky. She could feel his presence beside her, the faint warmth of his arm when the wind shifted. It should have felt awkward, but instead there was a quiet pull between them, one that made her aware of every breath, every heartbeat. Later in her room, she lay awake listening to the distant crash of waves. She could still hear his voice in her mind, low and certain. "You have my word." She wondered if he meant to keep it forever, or if there would come a night when she would want to break it herself. The thought unsettled her as much as it thrilled her, because for the first time, she was beginning to imagine what it might feel like to choose him, not out of necessity, but out of something far more dangerous. The wind off the ocean was colder that night, carrying with it the sound of waves pounding against the rocks below. Elena had tried to sleep, but the steady roar outside her window kept her restless. She paced the edge of Tiu. He roomed her bare feet, brushing against the cool tile, and the memory of Damien's voice from earlier circling in her mind. She will never be touched unless she asks. It had sounded like a promise carved in stone, and yet tonight it felt like a challenge she could no longer ignore. When she finally stepped into the hall, the villa was silent. The low flicker of firelight spilled from the half-open door at the far end. Damien was there, sitting in an armchair, his shirt collar undone, a glass of something dark resting in his hand. He looked up as she entered, and for a heartbeat, the only sound was the crackle of the flames. "You should be asleep," he said, but his voice lacked its usual distance. She stood in the doorway, unable to move under the weight of his gaze. "I couldn't," she admitted. The words caught in her throat, and before she could lose her courage, she added, "I keep thinking about what you said." Something shifted in his expression, though he did not speak. She crossed the room slowly, her hands twisting together until she stopped in front of him. Her voice was quiet but steady. "I want this, Damien. Not because I have to, because I want to." His grip on the glass tightened. Then he set it aside and rose to his full height, towering over her but not closing the space between them. His eyes searched hers as if looking for doubt. "Are you sure?" he asked. She nodded, and the faintest breath of relief escaped him. He reached up his hand, warm as it cupped her face, his thumb brushing her cheekbone. The touch was so careful it made her chest ache. She leaned into it and felt him tremble just slightly. When he kissed her, it was not rushed. His lips moved against hers with a patience that felt more dangerous than hunger, because it made her want to surrender completely. Her fingers curled into the fabric of his shirt, pulling him closer. His arms wrapped around her, drawing her against the solid heat of his body in two. His scent of him filled her head cedar and salt, and something that was entirely him. He lifted her easily, his hands firm yet reverent as he carried her toward the bedroom. The storm outside seemed to fade until all she could hear was the sound of her own heartbeat. When he laid her down, his gaze never left her face, as if he needed to be certain with every breath that she still wanted this. She did more than she had ever known possible. The world narrowed to the press of his mouth, the steady strength of his hands, and the quiet reverence in every movement. There was no rush, no demand, only the slow unraveling of the distance they had kept for so long. And somewhere between the warmth of his touch and the steady weight of his promise, she realized she was not afraid anymore. Morning light spilled across the room, soft and golden, drifting over tangled sheets and the steady rise and fall of Damien's chest beside her. Elena woke slowly, her body still warm from the night before. Her head rested against his shoulder, the steady beat of his heart, a sound she could feel as much as hear. For a moment she stayed still, letting herself memorize the feel of his arm around her, the weight of his hand resting lightly against her waist. She had not expected this, not the gentleness, not the quiet way he had made her feel safe in a moment she had once feared. When Damien's eyes opened, they were softer than she had ever seen. He studied her for a long moment, as if committing her to memory, before he leaned down to brush his lips over her forehead. "Good morning." His voice was low, but there was something almost unsteady in it. She smiled without thinking. "Good morning." They stayed like that for a while until he pulled away and reached for the drawer beside the bed. He took out a sealed envelope and placed it in her hands. Her brow furrowed. "What is this?" He told her to open it. Inside were documents, transfers, deeds, accounts. Her name was on all of them. She looked up confused. Damien met her gaze with flinching. "Everything I own is now yours. The house, the properties, the shares. If you ever choose to walk away, you can." The shock stole her breath. She shook her head. "I don't want your money, Damien." His eyes softened. "It's not about money, Elena. It's about trust. You gave yourself to me without fear last night. I want you to know I would never hold you here with anything but your own choice. If you stay, it will be because you want to." Her throat tightened, the papers trembling in her hands. Slowly she set them aside and moved closer. Her voice was barely more than a whisper. "I don't need these to stay. I already know where I belong." His hand cupped her cheek, his thumb brushing the edge of her lips. "Then stay," he said. She kissed him, not out of gratitude, but out of something deeper, something that felt like the beginning of a promise. When they finally pulled apart, he rested his forehead against hers, and for the first time she saw no shadows in his eyes, only the clear, steady truth of what lay between them. Later, as they walked through the villa, hand in hand, the sea stretched endless below, and the wind tangled her hair. Damien's grip was warm and certain. She realized then that whatever his past held, whatever secrets had once kept him guarded, no longer stood between them. The man she had once married out of necessity was now the man she chose without hesitation, and that choice was hers alone to keep forever.